First of all, I feel blessed, lucky to be one of the survivors of, what my experience was the war on cannabis. So when you tap back in the historical roots, there have been people who have stood up and helped redefine the social policy and the legal policy of cannabis. And many of us have suffered. Cannabis does have medicinal value. It can intervene in a number of different symptom clusters that we have. Why isn't there a medical advisory board to the Bureau of Cannabis Control? My right and the rights of my fellow citizens to have access to all of those resources, right, should not be unduly repressed by a minority that chooses to remain ignorant and afraid. The cannabis culture is one of being a socially responsible member of the community. It's really a difference of whether or not you're in it for the money or you want to change the world.
Boom, what's up everyone? Welcome to Simulation. We are still at New West Summit, the world's leading cannabis tech conference. We are now sitting down with Granddaddy Mike.
Hey folks.
Thanks for coming on the show.
Hey, thank you. Thanks for inviting me. I'm flattered.
And I'm super excited because Granddaddy Mike has 52 years with Granddaddy Mike Unlimited, and he's been building up within the cannabis industry for that long. And these are really important perspectives because they are right there with all of the variables of the evolution of what's been happening. And so as you vape right now, and I'm really excited for you to teach us about this, the first thing that I kind of want to talk about with you is that what have been some of the most fascinating sort of shifts, highs, lows, the troughs along the last 52 years of the journey of cannabis?
First of all, I feel blessed, lucky to be one of the survivors of, what my experience was the war on cannabis, right? And the repression of our government. So, I recall back in the mid-'70s when we really thought a proposal in California would legalize cannabis. So, there's some naive optimism to that kind of view. But since then, virtually everyone that I know that has survived a long time in this industry has gone through, major successes and, devastating failures. And I'm just fortunate. It's either good karma or good luck or blessings that have protected me when others have fallen. So there are, tens of thousands of people just like me. I'm really not special, who have, ended up dead or incarcerated through this process. And I myself have, had all of my assets seized. I've had all the product that was fronted to me to move seized. I've lost more money in this industry than many people will ever earn, right? And, when that happens, you have to have a certain amount of resilience and a certain amount of risk tolerance and a whole lot of trust from a lot of people that I've worked with who are willing to still, believe in me and front me enough product to rebound. My most recent significant defeat is, coming up on its 5-year anniversary, and I'm looking forward to celebrating the expiration of that warrant, right? And all of my assets and all of my accounts were seized, and there's an extant warrant out. So it was hands-off cannabis and hands-off any cannabis products until, that warrant expired and I could get now, licensed and regulated. I don't consider the new transition as legalization. I really think it's regulation and taxation. Yeah. And I really still believe it's unfortunately largely based on canophobia and propaganda and is inherently racist in origin and it's even though more recent statistics show that over 80% of the population in the United States believes that cannabis should be legalized in some form, some restricted to CBD or medical only. But we have been and are continuing to move steadily towards an increased consumption, increased consumer base, a wider distribution. And, all I've ever tried to do is bring more better product to more people at a fair price, right? So I abhor violence. I don't lie, cheat, or steal. And you would be hard-pressed to find anybody who has been harmed by anything that I've ever done. And yet, the government has considered to hound and harass and pursue me for that endeavor.
Man, so you started off with the war on cannabis, as though your example, like you said, is one of so many examples of people's lives being just turned upside down in ways that are just, it's so hard to even imagine what it would feel like to have assets seized, or your livelihood and the livelihood of other people, the health state, potentially the medicine that people are getting to be withheld from them, this type of stuff. That is all extremely crazy that it's been going on for so long. And then you went into how You mentioned how it was something about how this now kind of like the transitionary period is not about legalization, but it's about regulation and taxation. Teach us about that.
Well, once again, let's look back historically for just a minute, and I'm going to tie in the kind of suffering. Many people don't even remember who Dennis Peron was, right? So Dennis Peron was responsible for Prop 215, which was the Medical Compassionate Care Act that was passed in the state of California back in 1996. Now, prior to 1996, when he successfully, sponsored this bill and successfully, he had been involved for years in cannabis activism in San Francisco, and decidedly in the state of California as well. But most people don't realize that this diminutive, long-haired gay man, right, who owned a restaurant and was doing, he was the biggest dealer in the Castro district in San Francisco for probably a decade. And he was working his cannabis business out of the upper floor of his restaurant that was down in the Castro. During that time, when the AIDS epidemic, seized the gay population of San Francisco with alarm, and people were having catastrophic illness problems, he began compassionately distributing cannabis, right? And in conjunction with Brownie Mary, who was giving away brownies at the hospital to hospice and AIDS patients. Dennis was largely supplying, right, the ingredients that were going into that out of his own compassion program. So from that effort grew the Compassionate Care Act, which was the first legalization of medical cannabis in the country, right? That's great, and Dennis was wonderful at getting that performed. But what many people don't realize is, this man was arrested 26 times. This guy went to court on charges, trial 6 times, was convicted and spent a year in jail, and was shot by the police on 2 different occasions in the pursuit of arrest or exercising of warrants, right? So
It's a lot of sacrifice.
So this man suffered. He lost his apartment, he lost his business, he lost all of his inventory, and he still continued to come up with strategies that would press the authorities to redefine the parameters under which he believed, righteously providing access to patients who desperately needed and absolutely responded to the medication. So he felt, righteous that they were entitled to what he could provide and that he was committed to providing it. Now, there aren't many people that would go through losing their livelihood, every couple of years, right, in order to pursue that goal. But without that kind of sacrifice and that kind of suffering, arguably we certainly wouldn't be where we are today, right? So when you tap back in the historical roots, there have been people who have stood up and helped redefine the social policy and the legal policy of cannabis. And many of us have suffered, right? Financially and emotionally and, relationship-wise in the world. because of that. But that doesn't mean that we're not intelligent, articulate provocateurs, right? But there are a lot of people out there in the industry, and I'm not trying to lay a guilt trip on anybody, but that have had easy access to cannabis throughout their whole life. Always knew where they could get some. Always knew that they weren't going to risk gunplay and arrest for them to acquire their regular consumable cannabis, right? And you frankly take it for granted, and therefore don't realize that the struggle continues, right? It's good enough and it's comfortable enough now. So hey, it's virtually done. Well, truth be told, it's not virtually done. We have decades, perhaps generations of progress to be made here. And to be apathetic and passive at this time, right, is not respecting Mary Jane, right? And being devoted enough to all that she has done. Don't recognize enough all of what Mary Jane has done for you, right? Do something for Mary Jane, right? This is a marriage, and Mary Jane has expectations, and she's been, using and abusing me, like I said, for decades.
There was so much there. First of all, the history that you just started explaining around the Compassionate Care Act, and also Dennis Perone, and the Brownies was Brownie Mary. Wow, it's so important to know about the leaders in this industry that brought us there.
I don't want to offend anybody out there whose name I'm not mentioning, right?
Yeah, I'm still so many more.
Two stellar examples that represent thousands of people all over the country.
Yes,
who all deserve the same kind of recognition.
Yes. That's a really important point. So there have been lots of people over the last 50 plus years that have just went and sacrificed, went through suffering to provide us with the state that we have today. And then you laid out this very interesting spectrum. We'll get to the regulation, taxation, legalization stuff in a little bit. But you laid out the spectrum for us to understand. It's like either you have absolutely clear access to cannabis in the most safe ways possible, or on the other side of the spectrum is this: you have to go through violence, there's no cannabis available, there's all these different variables that you have to deal with to get cannabis. So and
you have to deal with somebody who generally has access to a lot of other drugs as well.
And that's also crazy when it's not just cannabis, but then you want to go for just cannabis, but then there's also like meth or heroin and all these other things involved. Okay, why don't you teach us about that spectrum? And also you mentioned how cannabis has a long history of racism. We are well aware, and we haven't talked about this too much on the show yet, but just about the sheer amount of African Americans, black people that are incarcerated due to cannabis-related crimes, and overall, I believe the number was around 60% of all people that are incarcerated are there due to cannabis-related causes, which is absolutely absurd. Please unpack.
The early anti-cannabis legislation, when the propaganda was Anslinger was slinging it, right? And it was the reefer madness phase in the 1930s, right? And that was, a racially inspired, it was economically motivated, but it was racially inspired. And by that I mean it was easy to enforce low-level criminalization on the Mexican, the Latino, and the black community. Right? And so the fear propaganda was, under the influence of cannabis, these otherwise docile and submissive people become aggressive rapists of our white women, right? And so, that you need to have that kind of paranoia about the effects of cannabis in order to propagate the kind of repressive restrictions that they put on it. So, that's original. But moving forward in history, cannabis possession and casual possession on the street, sometimes low-level transactions and dealing, was prevalent in the black and Latino community, right? And to the extent it was an easy pop, right? So if you, and it was easy to profile people, and it was easy to pat them down and find some portion of cannabis on them and throw them in jail, right? And start them on, into the, incarceration industrial complex, right? And that whole monetary thing. And when we think about the 60% of the population that's in, and I think it's for drugs, not just cannabis. I think cannabis only accounts for about maybe 40% of the population. Okay. But, back at that time, and as I mentioned earlier, traditional access, if you're dealing with somebody on a street corner or in an apartment building in a complex, right, the same guy that's selling weed is selling smack, is selling Quaaludes, is selling meth. I mean, it's a one-stop shop, and he's got everything. So the mere fact that you have to go there to get your cannabis exposes you to all these other different drugs and all these other people that are into all these other drugs.
Yeah.
Right? So,
and you just want to stay on that one and not gateway out into the others.
Yeah, but there was a gateway effect because you were having exposure at that point in time, right? Yeah. So, once again, cannabis use was prevalent. It was an easy pop on the street if you were profiling somebody and just wanted to hassle them. And we all know, law enforcement has been racist and repressive, right, for a long time. And so we have a minority population that's becoming the majority target for that kind of, unjustified and disproportionate attack. So to the extent that, the Black and Hispanic community are still, a good proportion of the consumer profile in this country, it seems to me only logical that they should have the same kind of representation on corporate boards, on business boards, on business ownership, on licenses percentages. And the access to this industry, right, should at least be representative, right, and open, so that it does not replete with hurdles that especially eliminate this minority community, right? There ought to be some way for special business development loans, for instance, to be set aside in incubator programs for people who have maybe a lot of experience in the cannabis industry but have never dealt with accounting and running a business, don't know the first thing about public relations beyond it's good if all their customers give them good word-of-mouth referrals. That's been the extent of their marketing sophistication in the past. And I don't mean to be critical. It's been effective enough so that they're still there. But now, as we transition into a new generation of open business practices, right, we need to figure out some way that we don't filter out this portion of our population.
Yes. And actually fully actualize them into the world. Absolutely. Okay, that was really good. Let's see if we can go to the next lily pad as we're jumping as a frog. The next lily pad is, let's go to the regulation and taxation versus legalization, what we're seeing right now.
So, yes, I make the distinction between legalization, which for me means fully integrating cannabis into our social practice and our social pattern, so that my undeniable right to pursue happiness and health, and in my business sense, and wealth, right, is not, unconstitutionally repressed because there are a bunch of irrational, right, fanatical people who have attitudes, right, that would like to interfere with my rights. I know now that I'm not a member of a silent and paranoid minority, right? I'm a member of a majority that I hope will become increasingly vocal and loud in asserting that just because there are some people who choose to remain ignorant, right, and have an emotional response, unreasonable, unwilling to look at facts and science, right, which I'm happy to use to justify that cannabis does have medicinal value. It can intervene in a number of different symptom clusters that we have. It generally contributes to overall wellness. I have a number of not just anecdotal data to support those kind of claims. And my right and the rights of my fellow citizens to have access to all of those resources, right, should not be unduly repressed by a minority that chooses to remain ignorant and afraid. Now, that paranoia, that fear, and assuaging that fear is an ongoing anchor, right, in the sea as we're trying to sail this ship through the rocks and shoals of what I would call legalization, right? And every time there's a new burdensome tax, right, that's like the current changes, right? And every time there's an increasingly repressive restriction, right, that's not based on reason, that's based on attitude, right? That throws out, you know, another storm that we have to navigate through. But the sea anchor of trying to continuously assuage and reassure the people who believe cannabis is going to destroy the world, right, is continues to make this approach, this transition, one of incremental small steps, right? And I'm impatient enough, if you will, here at the senior portion of my life. I would like to see this transformation completed during my lifetime. And the only way we can do that is if we stop trying to reassure the paranoid, right? That's never going to work. We just need to make the 60, 70, 80% of us who, you know, feel we do have rights to pursue health and well-being and, you know, happiness, if that's how we want to choose it with our cannabis use, you know, should be able to go ahead. So I get impatient. I think it's time for us to be bold. Yeah. And it, you know, the thing that bothers me the most is that, you know, that attitude of paranoia and what I call canophobia, right, permeates the legal language that is used to install the regulations and taxation system. And the greed to collect the taxes and to maximize the tax income beyond the expense of setting up a regulatory system, right? So I don't mind in the industry should pay in taxes for the cost of its own regulation. But the regulation needs to be reasonable, right? We have variance limits on, you know, cannabis lab tests in the state of California that are scientifically theoretical, impossible to meet. You know, we get so much different variance from, well, you know, how sunny it is and what kind of water supply you had and what nutrients you used. And every single one of those things that introduces new variance into the determination of the product. Not to mention that a sample batch that's harvested in the field will have different readings if they're top cola buds or if they're lower, you know, water leaf buds, et cetera. Different areas in the field may have different results, right? And so retesting the same product and not getting a result that's within 10% of the original value should not be disqualifying. It's just recognizing nature is variable, right? And, you know, bear in mind, again and again, can't repeat this often to us, nobody has ever died from the consumption of cannabis, right? So regardless of what criteria we're putting on it now and how repressive and restrictive they are, right, maybe some of them are paranoia-based and not rationally based. Why isn't there a medical advisory board to the Bureau of Cannabis Control? Why isn't there a scientific/laboratory advisory board to the Bureau of Cannabis Control? Why isn't there some way for us to inject scientific fact, right, into this process so it has to be recognized in the way the regulations are defined and the way that they're enforced, right? And, you know, I don't want anybody to think that I feel entitled, right, to impose, you know, my values. But, you know, I think
Speaking of scientific ones.
Yes.
We're talking about advising the medical side of how a government would educate its citizens on cannabis.
Right. Right now, we might be on the leading edge of coming up with what we're calling microdosed, right, products. Yes. So these are for people that, you know, want to have a little bit more frequently and control titrating their dosage by their frequency of dosing, right? And the microdose amounts are small enough so they escape the parameters of variance and quality control. We don't have testing accurately enough to consistently tell us how much microdose is in each finished package. And they won't allow us to submit a very homogenized sample of all the ingredient before it's put in that we can then divide scientifically by the amount delivered to calculate a final dosage. They won't allow us to do that.
You have to measure every 3 milligram Tic Tac.
No, not everyone. We can measure, we have to sample every, depending on the different product, we either have to sample one every 1,000, one every 3,000, one every 5,000, randomly selected from the final package, and it has to match the label content, right?
Within a certain amount.
Within 10%. And if it doesn't, then it's failed, and ironically, it's seized, it's interrupted in the distribution chain, right, until it gets retested and relabeled.
Yeah. So, as you're speaking about this, I'm getting these, these visions of us moving towards more scientific advisory on the medical side of the government for the health benefits, and just the legalization in general of the product. Also about you started venturing as well into some of the legalization, into the regulation and taxation. Now, within the regulation, these sort of tests that are happening to make sure things are within 10% are also, of course, it's important too. We need to make sure that the doses are exactly what they say for microdosing, especially for people that don't want to go way too high. And then on the taxation side of things, aren't a lot of the taxpayer dollars going towards education and towards other research programs? So the taxing is okay, yeah? To a certain extent?
A portion is going toward, I'm happy to say, is going towards education and research. From my point of view, not enough, not a high enough proportion. A higher proportion is going towards enforcement, right? Which is like, shouldn't surprise us, right? The ability of the authorities to monitor and examine and ultimately repress, right? The free access to this product is embedded in the whole process, right?
Tax dollars are going towards more policing.
We are hiring and training people to go out and do blind visits to dispensaries, unannounced, show up, knock at the door, show their badge, get access, and inspect and audit everything in the shop, including review access of the 90 days of video surveillance tape that they have supposedly been collecting on their facility. And they can do that unannounced at any time they want, right? Wow. And they can cite you for...
That's Big Brother. Yeah. That's a lot of strict oversight. That reminds me a lot of China.
And they can start by citing the receptionist with the fact that after they produced their badge, she didn't require them to log in before she gave them access to a secure area.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's ridiculous.
And they cite her for that.
They cite her, yeah, when they just walk up with a badge to get in.
And say, here, I'm here with the Bureau of Cannabis Control. Here's my identification. Yeah, and she doesn't say, oh, you cannot go by here until you sign again. Right? But I'm just saying, I've got dozens of these stories, right? Yeah. So
maybe we go on the as we're talking about the benefits of some of the taxation. I want maybe talk about some of the the 52 years that went by. We're at a pretty good place, even though we want to get it done before we pass. Before we're both gone. Like, we'd like to see civilization adopt this at a greater level, especially the medicinal side of things. Where are we at now in terms of things moving forward, and then what are you most looking forward to in the future?
What I'm most looking forward to in the future would be referring my mother to the board-certified endocannabinist who had finished a medical specialty residency and training in the endocannabinoid system, and having him be able to combine all of the other previous diagnostic medical data that had been collected with his own careful history taking and his own diagnosis, and use his mastery of the science to write a prescription that will have the basic cannabinoids, the THC and the CBD and the CBN and the CB and the CBN and the terpenes, right? And recommend 2 or 3 different delivery systems. So here's an edible for you, here's a topical for you, here's a tincture for you, and here's an inhalant for you, right? And explain the different methods of administration and absorption, and encourage people to keep track of their consumption initially until they understand how it's affecting their overall wellness system. And and I firmly believe that if there is a sarcoma in somebody's bone, right, that it will be possible to come up with an injectable form of high concentrate cannabis that can be delivered directly to the tumor and will result in significant remission. So, I mean, I believe all of that is possible. And I believe that the endocannabinoid system basically monitors the other systems of the body, right, and brings them into balance, brings them into homeostasis. And that's some of the magic of the plant, and the fact that, a lot of people don't realize every mammal on Earth has an endocannabinoid system, right? And it wouldn't be there except it responds to the endocannabinoids that we can deliver from cannabis. So in many ways, I think, it's almost a divinely inspired, complete system that we're almost completely ignorant of. And as smart as I may sound to some people, I want to let you know, I know less than 10%, right, of the information that's available. And that information is probably less than 10% of what we really should know, right?
Yeah, the only thing I know is that I know nothing. Yeah.
And the smart
totally
people know what they don't know.
No, yeah.
In terms of the limits of their knowledge.
Totally. You started painting this beautiful scenario that I'm also was just so loving the vision of in the future, of just being able to work with a medical professional that is just super good at their craft, and then being able to properly get dosage based on your biomarkers, who you are, whether it be a topical or an inhalant or an edible. That was just a great example. And then do quantified self to see how things are impacting you. That sounds like the most optimal scenario of the future, and I loved it. And that's a beautiful vision, and I'm really looking forward to that. I love that one. That's definitely one of my favorite parts of the conference so far, is that beautiful vision that you just painted. That was great.
Thanks,
Granddaddy Mike. That was so good. Do you have something else that comes to mind that you think is really important to share as we go out?
I'm blessed that I'm frequently sought for my opinion. Right? One of the strong mission, vision, value, goal level strategic plans that I adopt, and that I pretty much require all of the people that work with me to adopt, is that the cannabis culture is one of being a socially responsible member of the community, right? So you need to give back to your community. And I don't just mean geographically where you live. I mean the community of cannabis, the community that needs cannabis policy reform, the people that continue to need donations of your time and your money and your commitment to help see this process through.
We had someone on the show earlier at New West Summit that talked about the Global Cannabis Congress.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
It's all about social responsibility.
Right. And you need to do more than sit there behind your media and say, oh, yeah, that's a good idea. You need to stop watching this right now and go and look up organizations that you can actually volunteer to be a member, become a member, volunteer to help them with whatever production they're doing, and start sending in their money. And then get on the phone and enlist 10 other people as your cadre to do the same and support this so that we can get it done. Yeah. Right? So That's very important to me, and I think if you are a company that isn't willing to set aside 5-10% of your annual profits towards policy reform and community support groups and lobbying efforts for cannabis policy reform and education and whatever, I don't care what you do in any of those areas, but you do it is very important. And secondly, I'm going to tie it right back to Dennis Perone and compassion and where we came from, right? There ought to be a way that we have an untaxed track of cannabis production and distribution through to consumers who have, unfortunately are the victims of, catastrophic disease or disorder, or, have some kind of a chronic situation, and are indigent. And I don't think you should have to be, destitute in order to, get subsidized access in some way to cannabis, right?
What came to mind as you were saying that was that if there is somebody that is physically or mentally ill to a serious degree of their approaching death, their stage 4 cancer, they need the help of cannabis as an option, then I found it really interesting envisioning a sort of, like you said, non-taxed and a way for basically the whole world or the United States, whichever nations want to get involved, to funnel philanthropic dollars into a pool that can then draw from that pool into getting cannabis for the person that desperately needs it to survive longer.
And if everybody involved in the supply chain, right, devoted 5 or 10% of their service free of charge, nonprofit, right, I'm willing to reinvest. I'm willing to repay you for the cost of the fertilizers and the soil amendments and anything out of pocket, but you don't make any profit on this. And the people that do the transportation don't make any profit on this. And the people who do the concentrating don't make any profit. If everybody makes it non-profit, right, but just covers expenses, we can deliver some cannabis to people at, I believe, a quarter of the price that is currently retail in the market, right?
That's the sort of loving, caring mentality, that empathetic mentality. I love that. We love that. So I'm really happy that you brought that forward. The corporate social responsibility, just the essence of taking a percentage of what is being built and giving it towards the greater good of humanity at a corporate social.
It's really a difference of whether or not you're in it for the money or you want to change the world.
Yeah.
Right? And if you want to join me, we can change the world. The money will come.
Yeah, and actually there have been so many successful billionaires, millionaires, leadership, spiritual leadership, all different types of leadership from around the world that has been for the longest time saying, stop doing things for the money. Do it because you love doing it every single day, and the money comes and the people gravitate towards you, and that's how the best way to do it. That is a very powerful way to wrap things up. This has been very nuanced over the last 52 years. I love it. And we've only scratched the surface with all the information, but you definitely gave us really strong highlights. Granddaddy Mike, just really strong highlights. We really appreciate having you on the show. Huge thank you.
Thanks to everybody.
Yeah, thanks everyone for tuning in. As you all know, give us a comment below with your thoughts. We'd love to continue the conversation. Join the public telegram as well. Also, go build, go create, go manifest your destiny. Go and bring that forth into the world. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and we'll talk to you soon. Peace.